Good morning. I'm going to discuss, going on the same line like Bruno's presentation, but I'm going to give you a little bit more numbers. And especially I'm going to talk about the lack of rights of these temporary residents. So we're talking about, again, the Australian migration shift from a permanent residence and citizenship-based policy to a temporary migration policy. So basically, since colonization of Australia, the intention was to increase the population, facilitating the arrival and the settlement of migrants. Although some of the policies, as we all know, were a bit controversial, like the White Australia policy, they still aimed to attract people and who could eventually stay and settle in the country. However, in the 90s, especially in the late 90s with the arrival of John Howard, everything changed and there was a boost promoting temporary visas, especially in the student sector and with the creation of the 457 very debated visa. So the focus was no longer on a generic increase of population, but was more on a specific selection of skills, and so policies were driven by the market's necessities and the economic needs of the country. So in the past 15 years, there have been some important legislation amendments that have modified the system with the consequence of creating a pathway of a series of temporary visas that were trapping people living in Australia without being able to get permanent residence eventually. So many of these had to leave the country, and because of law changes that didn't allow them to stay longer. So they stay, all these temporary residents stay in Australia, they live here for many years, they pay taxes, they work, they study, they contribute culturally and socially to the society, but they have very limited rights, if any at all, and no access to permanent residence very often. So what's the impact of all this on the multiculturalism? What's their influence on the Australian society? Let's see some numbers. As you can see here, these are the last data of the last financial year. The Department of Immigration got a revenue from only visa application charges of about $2 billion. That's quite a number. So only visa fees, basically. And they granted about 200,000 permanent residents visas last year, of which about 13,000 to refugees. And everybody is complaining about these 200,000. So they have increased the traffic in the cities, they have increased the housing prices and all these things. But at the end of the day, the big numbers is actually that one of the temporary visas. And there was last year 8.4 million of visas granted. So I've taken out from this number students, working holiday, 457 and New Zealanders. We don't forget about New Zealanders. And why? Because these are the people basically have permission to work, and because of the nature of the visa, they tend to stay 1, 2, 3, 4 years in Australia. So they are 2.7 million. And these are those that contribute to the Australian society, economy, and so on. Let's start with the working holiday visa. So last year they granted about 200,000 in total, first and second visa. And as already Bruno said, they are increasing, the applications are increasing pretty much since 2014-15, probably because of the media releases about exploitations and abuse in the farms. And these working holiday visa makers are also fully taxed. So when they pay taxes, they don't enjoy the exemption from the minimum threshold that everybody else has, like the first $18,000. So they pay taxes on every cent. And when they leave Australia and want their superannuation back, they get taxed at like 64%. So they don't take much back with them. These are the numbers that Bruno already showed. As you could see, there is a peak in, let's say, from 2012 to 2014, and that was probably the period where media were depicting Australia like a paradise. Everybody was quite excited on the opportunities, and they were all coming to Australia. Then, as you can see, the numbers are decreasing dramatically, and I remember I saw last year an article on the Sole 24 Ore, which is quite like maybe the Australian Financial Review matching paper in Italy, where the big title was "The Australian Dream is Over." So now this bad publicity against Australia probably also contributes to the decrease in numbers. Let's talk about students. The student program is definitely the most convenient in Australia. As you can see, it has been valued last year almost 22 billion. So students bring a lot of money to Australia. And we had almost 500,000 international students in Australia last year, and they represented 21% of total students in Australia. We have also some peaks in some universities where, for example, currency universities, more than half are international students and almost half also in foreign universities. Most of them are Chinese, 29 overall, 29%, and in university we have 38% of Chinese students. So you can imagine if all of a sudden all these students decide to go to study somewhere else, what will happen to our economy? So these students basically pay much higher university fees as international students. They pay from 30 to 50% more than domestic fees. That's quite a lot of money. If they have children with them, it's a condition of the visa, they have to send their children to school, primary or high school. And even to public school, they will pay a lot of money. We're talking about from 6,000 to 11,000 a year per child. Plus, they have to pay for a health cover. That's another condition of the visa. So even if they, like the Italians, they have Medicare, they still have to buy an insurance policy, a private insurance policy. Now the costs are quite unreasonable. I conducted a private investigation about this matter, and I found out basically that if you are on a visitor or work, any kind of working visa, and you buy a single policy, so for example you pay 100, then your partner will join you in the policy, so you have a joint policy, you would pay 200, so basically double, which is quite reasonable. If you had children, more or less it would stay as 200, sometimes a little bit more. But if you are a student, so you pay 100 as a single policy, then your partner will join you, that will go up to 600. If you have children, it will go up to 1,000. And there is not actually any justification about this, because they receive exactly the same kind of cover, the same services, exactly the same. So I called all the main insurance companies. I sent emails, and the responses were more like, can you hold the line? I have to go to my manager. And the most honest response that I had was like, because that's it. This is the way it is. You can tell your client this is the way it is. Okay. And the funniest one was that student partners are more inclined to get injured. Where if you are a partner of a student visa holder, then it's very dangerous. Okay, so there should be more investigation to do on this. These are the numbers of Italians. As you can see here, we talked about the peak of the working holiday visa from 2012 to 2014, and you can see a peak in the 2 years after. So most probably the working holiday visas after the end of the visa jumped on a student visa. So it's like a continuation. And you can also see that the biggest numbers are for English courses and vocational courses. So you don't get many attending universities. Why? They don't have the money. Very easy. So apart from the fact they all need English courses, because unfortunately Italians are quite poor in the language, but they all tend to end up in vocational courses, and I predict a decrease of enrollments, at least in some some kind of areas of study because of the recent law changes. Okay, temporary workers, we're talking about 457 visas here. I didn't take into consideration other kind of work visas because they are all short visas. They have short period visas, so they stay maybe a month or two and then go away. So I wouldn't include that in the number. So last year we had 87,000 457 visa granted, and everybody is complaining about this 457 visa that was, as we said, was abolished 3 weeks ago and replaced by another visa, so nothing really would change much. But at the end of the day, as you can see, the student visas, working holiday, and also a post-study visa, which also has a permission to work, they are much higher numbers than the 457 visas. So are really these 457 visa holders that are stealing jobs to Australians? I don't know. To be a sponsor, you have to be paid at least a minimum salary, 53,900. So the government is saying that sponsors are exploiting the program so they don't recruit local workers, Australian workers, and they can underpay foreigners. But it's actually the government that never really raised that minimum salary since 2013. So, and if we consider that 457 visa holder, or now TSS visa holder, must stay with the same sponsor before getting permanent residence for 2 years, and now these 2 years have become 3, so you get stuck with a kind of salary without having an increase. So who is exploiting whom here? Obviously, I'm sure you've heard about underpayments, cost recovery. There were plenty on media, especially in franchising sectors, 7-Eleven, Domino's, whatever. And these are the Italian numbers. So again, continuing the trend, 2014, 15, up to 16, then the peak. So working holiday, student visa, and then they get sponsored. This is usually the trend. And you can also see that most of the Italians are sponsored in the hospitality sector, mainly restaurant managers, cooks, and chefs. Now, restaurant managers really were people who were waiters in Australia. They came here and they enrolled in the diploma hospitality management. That was quite on fashion. Now, because the law changes, that will not give any pathway to permanent residence, so I predict there will be a collapse of this kind of course. Also, the type of courses that Italians or other nationalities would choose also depends on the marketing of the education agents. Sometimes courses are more on fashion than other courses, and they are like pushed in some directions because they think that there is some hope to get permanent residence from there. So that doesn't really mean that all these people wanted to be a restaurant manager. Cooks and chefs are, at the moment, are the only ones that can get permanent residence. So I predict that for next year, everybody will be a chef. For sure. Yeah, so that will increase. I would like also to mention New Zealanders, almost 2 million every year. They come to Australia with a special visa. They can work, study, basically live like an Australian. They don't have any kind of restrictions, but not all of New Zealanders get all the Centrelink subsidies, for example, since especially the Australian government changed the social security agreement with New Zealand in 2001. So now even them are not really in a nice condition. And also we have refugees that we have almost 20,000 asylum seekers waiting to be processed in Australia. So they also here, some of them working and so on. So these are the typical pathways that all these temporary residents will follow usually. So you go from a working holiday visa student, and then you get sponsored, and then you get PR, or you get 2 working holiday visas, then you get sponsored, or you get 2 students, then you get sponsored. And the first 3 pathways are usually those used by Italians, while the last one, I'll probably say, is more for people going to university like Chinese, Indians. Because they get a bachelor, and they have the chance to get a post-study visa that will give them the option of staying in Australia for another 2 years and work without restrictions. So even with the new laws that's now imposed to have work experience besides a qualification, they are kind of safe because they can still have, in case, 2 years to work and get sponsored. But most of the people going to university getting bachelor's or master's or PhD, they usually have enough points to apply for permanent residence without having any sponsor. And obviously, the university area of the whole student system is where the money is. It's the sector where the money is. So the government basically didn't touch that, obviously. So the common denominators of all these pathways basically that it would take you from 4 to 6 years to get permanent residence. And I think that it's going to increase as well in the next years because of this, all these law changes. So we have all this, as I said, we have all these people in Australia, they get exploited and have lower wages sometimes, they pay higher taxes like working holidays, they have expensive health covers, they have to pay for children's schools and so on, so they don't have all the subsidies with Centrelink, they have a lot of restrictions, and all of this with the hope maybe one day to become permanent residents. So what's behind all this? It has never been really a mystery that the immigration system was based on economy till I think 2 or 3 years ago, I can't remember, but the Department of Immigration website was having a slogan that was called "People Are Business," and that says it all. And luckily they took it off. It was there for a few years. But the question is how much money they should get from migrants before becoming permanent residents, and should they get a right to become a permanent resident after a while? And also recently, since country security has become very important in Australia, this has also become an excuse to change laws and have the Minister for Immigration to acquire much more power. Also, how many of these laws are changed based on market necessities and not really on just electoral necessities or propaganda? A clear example is that of the list of the eligible occupations for visas. So you know that it is supposed to be changed depending on the market needs. But we had many events where they took off some they took out of the list some occupations, and then with some action from industry groups lobbying, then after a couple of months the occupation was back on the list. So is it really a market need or what? And that happens, for example, with university lecturers. All the universities went to the government and they complained, so after a while university lecturer was again eligible for permanent residence. That happened recently with management consultant. We had KPMG, Deloitte going to the government, what are you doing? And after 2 months, he was back on the list. Easy. So who are the favorites in the immigration system? Those who bring money, I think you got that, and China is in pole position, especially because besides crowding the Australian universities, there are also others who apply for business visa and they bring millions. About 95-96% of business visas are applied from Chinese. Who are the disadvantaged? Those who come from countries so-called at risk, Albanians, for example, we were talking about that earlier, and they struggle even to get a tourist visa or a student visa unless, obviously, they enroll a university course. Is there any different approach between the two major political parties? I haven't seen any really for the last 15 years. The Liberals invented the 4% visas, the Labour complained about it, but then it was the Liberals to make it more difficult. Sometimes, it doesn't make sense. The Liberals were placing refugees in detention, Labour was complaining about it, but it was actually Labour that created the detention centres, and also the law that doesn't allow any refugee coming by boat now to settle in Australia, they're all in Papua New Guinea. So what kind of Australia we want in the future? We define Australia as a multicultural society, but what is really multiculturalism? There is no legal definition in Migration Act or Citizenship Act. What are the rules, the responsibilities of the government and not only citizens of Australia or permanent residents, but also the temporary residents, and especially what are the rights of these people? The only document that I recall about multiculturalism recently that I saw was a kind of booklet from Julia Gillard, but it was very generic and doesn't really set up rules in regards. So more research is required in this field, and especially the recognition of this part of society that may not be given an identity, and that after all, they all influence socially, culturally, not only economically, the strong society, but we don't know in what way. Thank you.